Welcome to our Sunday series, and this is one of our talks as part of the Interwoven Contemporary Basketry show. And I would like to welcome our speaker for today. If everyone would like to give her a round of applause. All right, I will leave it over to you.
All right. Okay, so my name is JEANNET LEENDERTSE, and I'm here today to talk to you about seaweed as a sustainable craft material. Now, the question that most people first want to ask when I tell them that I work with seaweed is like, seaweed, like how smelly is it? And well, what I do is I keep it really cold. I keep the material in its natural environment. I keep it in salt water. I keep it in a cooler, so this is not a party. This is my work. And so the seaweed stays in the salty water, and I wrap it in salty, wet fabrics while I'm working on it. And then when it's completely finished, I dry it all at once. And what happens is that you skip the decomposition in that process, and so you don't get the fishy or the sulfury smells that you would get, like what you get on a humid hot day on the beach. So what you are left with is basically sort of a briny smell. I think of like fresh oysters. I think it's actually quite pleasant, and I consider it part of the work. So yeah. So I harvest the seaweed, and then I next slide. So I'm from the Netherlands. Previous, sorry. The dunes, please. Yeah, okay. So I grew up in the Netherlands, and the coastline looks like that. So very much like the Cape, sandy beaches, dunes, but that's what I was used to. So next slide. I grew up in the Netherlands. That's that tiny little red country in the middle of Europe there. Sometimes people get quite confused when I say I'm Dutch. When I'm from the Netherlands, they think that you're German, like Deutsch, or from Denmark. But I actually, and then the Netherlands, they also call it Holland, so it's all pretty confusing. But I grew up here on the coast. You can see on the right, it's enlarged, and the group of islands that you see down south there is called actually Sealand. So Zeeland literally translates as Sealand, so that's why I grew up. So I grew up in a working class family, so art school didn't really seem to be like the most sensible direction to choose for education, and I finally did apply to art school and majored in graphic design as a sort of more practical major. And as part of that program, I needed to do an internship, which I did in New York City, so that's how I ended up in the US. I then ended up in Boston, where I worked for the MIT publishing department and designed books there. I then eventually started my own business and designed books for publishers and individuals that were self-publishing, like here in the US. So that's sort of quickly my background. During that time, in summers, we would go on vacation to Maine, and I found myself we found ourselves every summer sort of moving further and further up north until we ended up on the Blue Hill Peninsula, and we're like, wow, okay, this is where we need to be. And I sometimes now think it's sort of, it was meant to be that I end up on this other group of islands, loosely connected islands. Yeah. So the sounds and the smells are all very familiar. So this shows you what the landscape looks like. It's very much influenced by the last ice age. So the glaciers left all these erratics behind, these big boulders, and so it's a very rocky coastline for people who haven't been there. So this is one of my favorite places. It's called Fly Point. It's not very far from where we live there, and it's just this beautiful piece of beach, rocky beach, where you can walk way out at low tide. So as my two sons sort of became more independent, I started to move away from my graphic design work and started to do more fiber work. And that started out kind of slowly. I started printing on fabrics first, you know, graphics, so sort of familiar territory. And then I started making accessories instead of books. And you can see that more and more the main coastal landscape sort of started to creep into my work. I took a whole lot of fiber classes, some at Wesleyan College in England, some at Rhode Island School of Design, at Haystack Mountain School of Craft. Yeah, so I worked with fibers for a number of years, and then next slide maybe. So going back to the coastline, so the reason that I actually ended up working with seaweed is like, well, I was basically surrounded by it. I mean, if you can see, it's everywhere. It's all along the coast. So here you can see how abundant it really is. The Blue Hill Peninsula actually has a tidal difference of 12 feet between high and low tide, which means that, you know, the section that this rockweed can grow in is quite wide. On the right you can see some other species. It can be found with, like on the top it's fucus, for instance. At the bottom is the seaweed rockweed that I use. I think maybe here on the Cape you find fucus maybe more frequently than the rockweed with the longer branches. Anyway. Yeah. So here you can see how rockweed attaches to the rock. It's they're called the holdfast, the way it attached. So they're not really roots because they clearly are not getting any nutrition from the rocks. Seaweed sort of absorbs all its nutrition directly from the ocean water. Okay. So here you can see how rockweed grows. It's actually a perennial, so it keeps on growing. And interestingly enough, while you see it has these bladders, these air bladders, they're called vesicles, and just like with a tree, you can actually see how old the rockweed is by seeing the distance between one level of these vesicles, bladders, and the next one. So what happens in between is like 1 year of growth, basically. So it's not very fast growing, and that's one reason why we need to be careful as to how we harvest it or how we use it. So as I was exploring rockweed more and more, I became familiar with the Rockweed Coalition, and their goal is to protect that habitat. Rockweed is actually used in a variety of ways. It's used as fertilizer. It's used in pet foods, if you want to believe that. It's used as a thickener in a lot of even cosmetics and paints. And so And then on top of that, there's just been a lot of seaweed interest in general, and it appears in health food stores more and more. And so you could see how it just could easily become another commodity and be over-harvested, especially when it gets to be machine harvested, like what's just happening in some areas right now. It happens a lot in Canada too. So I think it's really important that we protect this resource because it's basically it's the underwater forest. So if you can imagine that rockweed that was laying flat on the beach, as the tide comes in, the water lifts up all the rockweed because the little vesicles, the little air bladders, are all floating. And so you get this underwater forest, which is just filled with creatures. Then at low tide, there's insects, there's birds, like starfish can survive between low tide and high tide if they get stuck in the seaweed because it's cool and it's wet. So it's really important that we keep this resource, that we protect this resource. So again, here you can see a little bit more like different species that it occurs with. What you see on top there is sugar kelp. So that's another seaweed that I on occasion use, mostly the stems to create handles for my work. Anyway, yeah. You can see, you can see some of the little snails in the foreground. They love being on the seaweed, so they're definitely another species that's heavily dependent on the seaweed. So when I harvest my seaweed, I do it extremely carefully. I leave the holdfast intact. I leave 16 inches at least of the algae intact. And I harvest in a variety of different places. So I really give the plants the chance to recover and to regrow to its, yeah. Mm-hmm. So here you see me trying to find some rockweed for my next project. I try to select rockweed for the particular project that I'm working on at that time, because just like in families, there's just a wide variety within the rockweed family. So some algae appear as they have very wide branches and tiny little vesicles, for instance, and then other plants have very thin, elongated branches and large vesicles. So there's quite a bit of variety, and sometimes I just think of them as, like, as I said, families. Like, we all know families where everybody is like really tall and skinny with big heads, or or anyway, or big and stocky families, yeah, but tiny heads. So anyway, so you can see how long these branches actually are. And so it's very easy to leave 16 inches attached, and there's so much length to work with. So as I harvest the branches, I take off the side branches, because as you can imagine, when you start sewing or coiling it, you don't want to have all these side branches to deal with. So I split them off, and the longest ones I use as well. And so, yeah, so here you can see how the rockweed dries. So it becomes very dark in color and brittle and kind of fragile, really. And so when I first was thinking of working with rockweed, I had this idea that I really needed to preserve the seaweed, because, like, how could I work with it? How can I do anything with it if it got so fragile when it dried? And so I tried all kinds of processes with some home-found plant preserve recipes that I found online, and everything got kind of pretty stinky and smelly, so that was definitely not a good direction. And so I that was not a good direction. So I sort of gave up on it for a while and started to just work on other things. And then one day I'm on the beach and I see this sort of seaweed that had blown by the wind into some sort of circle and in a nest-like form, and it had dried that way. And I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, there's sort of strength in numbers, so maybe if I coil it and I just attach every strand to one another, I can develop enough strength to actually, you know, get a shape, get a basket, get something that will stay solid. So I took some home just to try it, and this is like my first experiment. So you can see here I coiled and sewed some seaweed, and that was the result. And then I started exploring like how to best sew it, like what material I should use. So I ended up with waxed linen as being sort of the best material to use for that. The wax helps slide through the seaweed easily, but at the same time it sort of grips it, and sometimes it feels like almost like I'm making sutures, you know, because the seaweed tissue is sort of somewhat live, and the wax linen sort of really seems to hold it together very well. So here you can see the density of stitches that is kind of needed to create a sturdy basket. So you can see it's a pretty time-consuming process. I then used beeswax to sort of wax my wax linen even more, so to speak, so it's nice and smooth and solid. So what I ended up sort of rediscovering in a kind of a crazy way is that you know, seaweed developed or evolved, I should say, to withstand these high tide and low tide cycles. So even though it can dry all the way out or most of the way out at low tide, when the tide comes in, it's like refreshed, it's like new, it's like all green and lovely again. So I found out that if I make a basket and I even dry it for several weeks or months, if I put it like back into salt water, it will actually like completely revive. Like what you see on the right side, it's actually the same rosette that I had dried for several weeks and then put back into salt water. And so it really comes back to life. And so when I make a basket and it dries and I don't like the way it dried, I can actually re-wet it and sort of reshape it in a way to sort of give it a different shape. So, so even though seaweed as a material, or as a species I should say, is like 3.5 billion years old, actually it's been around that long, it was recently, because of my work, added to the Future Materials Bank, which I think is kind of funny for it being such an old material in a way. So the Future Materials Bank is, if any of you are craftspeople, I highly recommend checking them out online, because it's a collaboration between the Jan van Eyck Academy in Amsterdam and the Central St. Martin's Academy in London, and it's a collection of materials that are sustainable. A lot of them come from the human waste, from the waste stream, industrial waste stream, and so it's really collecting new materials that we haven't really thought of before, you know, to use in craft or design, or even maybe for future production of you know, designed items. So here's a seaweed vessel that I sewed with horsehair, and it was one of the other materials I wanted to try out, because I found out that as the basket dries, the thread, because the seaweed shrinks, the thread becomes more important. And so if you use a very thin thread, like horsehair, you get a different kind of lace effect than when you use thicker material like wax linen, for instance. So here you can see that lace effect that I was referring to. So yeah, as you see, as the seaweed dries, it becomes a much more prominent part of the basket than when this basket is wet. So far I sort of developed two different ways of working with seaweed, two different ways of stitching it. If you imagine the branches of the seaweed like as a ribbon, you know, sort of flat. For the top one, I use the ribbon like this, you know, and I stitch it on the outside. And so you get this sort of rhythm of stitches. Whereas at the bottom, I use the seaweed like this, and I stitch it on the inside. And so the effect is a sort of more, you just see the seaweed with just a little bit of the thread shining through, and you get that more undulating effect of the seaweed itself. So this is a basket I made that was inspired by some Japanese pottery that I had seen, and I used a driftwood handle that I found on the beach to complete it. And here you can see how I use the two techniques. So I use, in the rosettes is one technique, the top and the bottom of the basket are a different technique. This is a basket I made with a handle of the sugar kelp that I was referring to earlier. Sugar kelp, some species of sugar kelp have actually a very long sort of tubular stipe, it's called stipe, and I sort of dry that in a shape to be able to use it as a handle. I'm now discovering that in the previous basket, some of the coloring changed over time, and I'm now discovering that sea bleaching plays, or sun bleaching plays a role in that. So I'm exploring how exposure to sunlight can actually change the color of the material in a natural way, and I'm hoping to introduce more of these like warmer tones into my work that way. So here's a basket where I just sort of kept going and going, basically. And I was sort of imagining like what happens if you like stick your arm into that, you know, like how much of your arm are you willing to risk in this sort of new weird material. So here you can see how soft the basket is before it dries. It's sort of like you're working with fabric. You can drape it in a way. And so what I do is I basically stuff the basket when it's done with paper towels that I reuse over and over and over again. And I give it shape. And depending on how many paper towels I stick in there and how you can kind of like squeeze it, and so you can give it sort of shape that way. And the drying is a process that you can't really control all too much. So the seaweed will do what it wants to do to some extent, but I like that tension between me trying to shape it and the seaweed wanting to do its own thing. I think that sort of creates interesting shape. So here's this one. This basket I developed for an organization called Steinbeißer. They are an outfit that they organize dinner events for which they invite craftspeople and celebrity chefs. So, and the idea is that the utensils and the baskets and all the tableware is challenging or unusual. So you might go to one of their events and your spoon might be connected to the spoon of your neighbor, for instance. So it's sort of an interesting way of experiencing the meal, slowing down the meal. So it's all about slow food also. And so they asked me to do the bread baskets, and I was thinking, okay, so what is it like when you get a bread basket in a restaurant? I mean, usually they put it on the table. It's usually not enough bread, right? And then you have this very awkward moment where you either reach for the bread or don't reach for the bread. And I kind of wanted to emphasize the awkwardness of that even more, and with the idea that you know, to get your bread, you would have to reach way into this belly of this beast. So, you know, making a dinner experience just a little bit more different or challenging that way. So this basket, the shape of it is sort of influenced by the erratics that you find, you know, the big rocks, the big granite boulders that were left from the last ice age on the beach, and yeah. So those shapes sort of start creeping into my work, I think. Yeah. So why I hope that my seaweed work sort of stands on its own, but I definitely also just want to call attention to this resource because seaweed is so important for the natural world. I mean, seaweed captures carbon, so in this time of global warming, that's just hugely important. It's a habitat. It's there's deacidification of the water because of the carbon capturing. It protects the coastal line from the rising tides because it sort of works as a buffer on the rocks. And so all of these things I think are important to draw attention to, and you know, that I hope my work will do that too. So thank you for coming, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I have some samples here you want to touch or feel or pick up. I brought some of my work in wet form also, so you can see what that looks like. I will pull that out and put that here. So, yeah.
Are baskets to be used as a basket or just a piece of art?
I think mostly as a piece of art, because they're still a little bit fragile, and you can use them like passively, like a bread basket, for instance. I think you could use them okay, but I think you wouldn't use it to carry heavy items in, for instance. I think that would eventually break them. Yeah.
I think you said you dry them quickly. Do you bake them or what?
No, I air dry them. What I just mean is, like, I don't let it sit in between times that I work on it outside of my cooler, because that's when you get bacteria that start to live on it and it becomes all slimy and smelly. So I don't bake it, I just finish it wet and keep it wet until it's fully done, and then I just air dry it all at once. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that its natural dark color there?
It is. It is. It dries that dark. But what's interesting is that, you know, as you can see here, there's some sea bleaching going on, or sun bleaching. I'm sorry. So you can see that the color can get quite light. So that's something that I'm still looking into.
Does the bleaching happen when it's wet still, or when it's dry?
No, I think it happens when it's dried. Yeah. And you know, this is sort of a little piece that I made, that I worked on, that is just made with the different, you know, with the bladders only. And you can see, you know, the variety of color, basically, the colors that it can dry to. And I'm still looking into what influences that. I mean, could it just be one algae family versus the other, one location where you harvest or forage versus the other? Is it how it was dried? So many variables. I mean, yeah, I need a scientific approach, I suppose. Yeah.
Do the air bladders contain just air, no moisture at all?
They contain a little bit of moisture, but I think, but they're mostly just air. Yeah, yeah.
The purpose is to float.
Their purpose is to float the seaweed. Yeah, yeah. And some of them get quite large, you know, when the plant gets very old. So sort of usually on the bottom you see the bigger, you know, vesicles, and then towards the top they get smaller. And if you see underwater footage of it, I wish I had brought some of that, but it really feels like you're in a forest, because as you can imagine, it sort of floats up and then sort of drapes down to some degree. Yeah.
The other question I had was, you said you could calculate the age by the number
Yeah.
of prongs.
By the vesicles. So, so if you look at the plant, you will see on a branch, you know, you have a vesicle, then you have a bunch of growth, and then you have another vesicle. So
The vesicles are the prongs that come
the
out?
vesicles are the bladders. So you have the main branch, which is called the thallus, then you have the side branches, and the vesicles are both on the side branches and the main thallus. So you choose one branch, basically, the thallus, the main branch that attaches to the rock, and you start counting the bladders, and so that way you can count how
It's
old.
not a question of counting the.
No, you don't count all of them. You just
Count all
the-
the bladders on each?
on one. So if you imagine each year is a year of growth, and so the side bladders might get vesicles, and the main one gets a vesicle. So it's in between those two that the growth takes place. It's not always accurate, clearly, because a lot of the rockweed gets also, you know, when there's a big storm out, some sections break off. So, you know, you might think that it's younger than it really is, because some section has broken off in a big storm and is now floating out to sea. But generally, if it's in a bit of a protected area, you can kind of tell how old it is. Yeah.
So that black thing is actually used as a bread basket at a function?
Yeah, it will be. Yeah.
Oh, it will be.
It
So
will be.
people have to put their hand in
You put your hand in
and get
and
the
you
bread.
reach for your bread.
Okay.
And it is, I invite you to look up this organization called Steinbeißer, because it makes it a little bit easier to understand. They have several videos up of what their dining events look like. It's quite interesting. I mean, the food is beautiful, and it is designed just to go with whatever the utensils and the tableware is. But it's also very unusual. I mean, as I said, like literally your spoon might be connected to somebody else's spoon, or you have this ridiculously long tool and you can't even get the food in your mouth, so somebody else needs to feed you. And it's all about just sort of experiencing, I think, you know, food in a new way, and collaborating, and yeah, just having a fun, unusual experience, and experiencing the craft, experiencing the tools.
And what was the name of that?
Steinbeißer, that's Steinbeisser. Yeah.
When you're making those cylinders,
Mm-hmm.
all that seaweed is all wet.
Yes.
Are you shoving paper towels in it as you're going along?
No,
To keep it in that shape?
no, I don't. I imagine what the shape will look like, but I don't stuff it until it's fully finished, because I'm a little worried that when I leave a lot of like wet towels or stuff or material in there, that it will still somehow, you know, create bacteria growth and things like that. So
Doesn't collapse or anything?
no, well, it's sort of like, it's like making a sweater, for instance, you know, and you have this, you know, you're making the sleeves, but instead of putting it on, I fill it up. Yeah. yeah, like that. So I don't know if you can see that, but so it's that soft.
How long does it take for it to dry while you're working on it? How much time do you have before that dries up?
So once it's all done, it dries, I would say, 8 to 10 days. And I just really pay attention to like keeping it really dry, so I don't put it outside in humid weather. So I keep it in an environment that like either is air conditioned in the summer or that is not too humid, because then still you might get some bacteria and smelliness. But yeah, in 8 days. But it continues to shrink, actually. I mean, it's dry and you could use it and display it, but there's so much moisture in this material, and over time it just becomes smaller and smaller, and you see more and more of the stitching, and that's actually something that I really enjoy because it becomes sort of lacy in a way. Yeah.
Now, that's the one you did with the horsehair, correct?
No, the one with the horsehair is, I think that's, I didn't bring that with me.
Oh, so all of that up there was wax?
That's all waxed linen, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I should have brought that one too, so you could see the difference. But I did bring the horsehair so you can have an idea of what it, is like with thickness-wise compared to the waxed linen, yeah?
How long can you work, when you're working on it,
Mm-hmm.
are you working on it in there while it's wet?
No. I have it, I actually use these very same mats. I just put it on my work table. I have usually like a salt water wet towel underneath it. And as soon as I'm finished, I just fill it up with salty, some salty wet cloth, and I wrap it in there, and I keep it till the next day. So I constantly change the cooling elements in my cooler. Yeah.
It seems like something like a breadbasket would take hundreds of hours. Have you become more proficient, faster, as you've gotten through this?
Yeah, I've gotten faster, but to be honest, the slowness of the work, in a way, it doesn't bother me so much. I'm not making them, so that everybody can go buy their seaweed bread basket at Crate and Barrel or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's partly a meditative process in a way. I mean, you work with this ancient material, and so the slow stitching was actually really grounding, especially like during COVID.
Have you ever considered putting like some contrasting thing inside?
Color-wise, you mean?
Yeah, maybe something white or that, I don't know.
Yeah.
You could put something in that would be part of the piece.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine it evolving, my work evolving in a whole variety of ways. I did recently purchase some other color waxed linen to experiment with, because I think it might be nice to refer back to the original color of the seaweed by using some like ochres and greens, nothing too bright, just sort of natural tones. But I also like the idea of maybe experimenting more with, bleaching of certain sections. I mean, maybe I can cover up certain areas and have some areas exposed to light and change color, and keep other areas black. So this is all,
The
possible.
piece that's on the screen reminds me of something called a decorator worm, that they're in the bay on Cape Cod, and the worm creates this house around itself,
Okay.
and it's inside, and then it can come out and find things to eat.
Okay.
While it's hiding in there.
Well, I do think my shapes are sort of going towards kind of, shapes that you might actually see near the ocean, like there's a lot of sea creatures that sort of, and plants, and if you on my feed, my Instagram feed, I actually post a lot of photographs of my of just the environment, because I find it very inspiring, and I think these shapes and forms and colors sort of like slowly get into my work. Yeah.
Oh, I just have to say, I really like the way you mix the driftwood with the
Mhm.
That adds such a beautiful dimension.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's fun to collect it too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have some actual Mainers in the audience here. Yeah. Any other questions?
How many years since your first successful experiment?
It's only been like 15 months or so.
15 months?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So this is all still very new, and so when people ask me, like, how will it hold up, or you know, where are you going? I'm like, I don't know.
So this truly is a COVID process.
Yeah, it was very much a COVID thing, because I was actually working with other fibers, and it sort of became impossible because of our family situation, just doing all the dyeing, which I used to do in the kitchen, became just not very practical. So it sort of all coincided, like looking for a material that was more sustainable, which I wanted to do anyway, because I was working with silk. It's very difficult to figure out where your silk is really coming from. You know, you cannot really trace it. So I was trying to stay local. So it sort of all came together that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I can pull out the wet basket if you guys want to see that. So this is a work in process, and it's actually, you know, it's going to be an accompanying basket for the same Steinbeißer organization. So I meant to make a whole number of them for this event, because they're going to have multiple tables. So if you want to come feel it, you're welcome to. On this one?
Yes.
I don't know. Several weeks. Yeah. Yeah.
Does
It's a little nutsy. Yeah.
the color, when does the color become black?
As it dries.
As it dries, so that's already as dry as some at some point.
Well, it looks more green.
It
You
looks
can
more
see
green.
at the
Yeah,
bottom.
Yeah.
I think here you know the stitching,
Oh, yeah.
which is black. I have been choosing black because I feel it's nicer when it all sort of becomes one. So you can see that it's still fairly green here. The seaweed itself actually changes color quite a bit, and in the fall it gets actually this real golden color. It's absolutely beautiful. So it starts out kind of a bright green, and then it gets sort of like a more like an ochre golden color, and then towards the winter it gets more like this. Yeah.
If you use the gold color, would it then still just dry black?
It will
Yeah.
still dry black. Yeah, that's sort of the sad thing in a way, that I cannot hang on to these colors. So I either have to bring them back into the work in a different way, you know, by using colored thread, or I can work with, you know, the colors that maybe might naturally occur, like rusts and browns and things like that. Yeah. I mean, I guess I could, you know, display my baskets in water. That's another idea. Then we could hang on to the original color.